Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. This is one of those special episodes of The Journey Home in which I have a guest returning. And this particular guest that's returned tonight, I'm not sure how many times he's been on the program because he's never really ever been himself before. Kevin O'Brien, former atheist, but he's part of the Theater of the Word, and you may have seen him on EWTN, or you may not, whether you knew it or not, because he's played a variety of people, both on The Journey Home as well as other programs on EWTN. You've done theater on Shakespeare on EWTN with Joseph Pierce's programs, of course, G.K. Chesterton programs.
Yes.
And first of all, Kevin, it's great to have you on the program.
Thanks, Marcus. Great to be here. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, it's funny sitting here because do we break out into a script of, some kind of theatrical performance, or do we get down to the real us? If we can ever find that. But.
Indeed, yeah. Well, I think there's enough reality here that we can focus on that.
No, and part of the reason I'm being humorous is because I do love theater, and though I'm the worst actor that ever lived, I've enjoyed what times I've had with theater, and so I greatly appreciate not only the work that you do, Kevin, but the challenge of it today, when the genre of the arts has so changed and at such an increasing pace with all the different aspects of media. And how do you get back down to just standing in front of a group of people and being able to convey a character and a theme and a story?
That's part of our call as the Theater of the Word Incorporated, which we named after the Theater of the Word, which was Karl Wojtyła's acting company in Nazi-occupied Poland. And so, at great risk to their life and liberty, they would perform these shows in living rooms and more or less in the catacombs in order to keep alive the tradition of Polish literature, Polish dramatic literature. And the whole concept behind the Theater of the Word was not a lot of trappings, not a big set, not fancy gadgets, not light shows, no lasers. It would be the script and the actors' simple costumes right there in your living room, so the material would be communicated. And that's our idea too. We travel in our little minivan, which has 180,000 miles on it. We pack everything in, our backdrop, our lights, our sound system. I have never have any more than 4 actors because we can't have more than 4 people fit in the van. So with almost nothing, we have to communicate to people and convey the gospel message and convey it in an entertaining and an engaging way. So that's part of our challenge, and part of it is almost deliberately countercultural in that we're stepping outside of all that glitz and barrage that we're hit with in the media.
One of my favorite programs or channels on television, besides EWTN, of course, is there's a classic movie channel. I love watching the old black and white movies, and partially because I enjoy the genre, but also because there's a historical element. When you watch a movie from the 20s or the 30s, and the life that they're portraying is innocently just a clear portrayal of what life was like in the 20s and the 30s. They have no idea what life is going to be like in the 40s and 50s or our century. And it seems that when you look at the life of the 20s and the 30s, there's an innocence there, dare I say, less sophisticated. But because of the media and the immediacy of the internet and everything, we've lost some of that innocence. And my guess is that when people would see theater in the 19th century, actors, there was a sense in which they could get into the story more than today. We've been so inundated with everything that I'm wondering if it's harder for the audience to get into what the actors are trying to communicate.
Well, we're more cynical and ironic, certainly. I think people are still surprised by how something simple right before them on stage can touch them. But part of what you're saying, that's part of the history even of showboats in this country, where the more exaggerated style of performance that the actors used to give in the 19th century and early 20th century on the showboats, by the time even silent films came out, they would then go into larger towns and the audiences would jeer them. So they would make fun of the acting styles of these melodramas, and that's how comedy melodramas developed, so that the actors would then encourage the audience to cheer the hero and boo the villain. That grew out of the fact that the audiences became more cynical, even with silent films, and were less willing to accept that more simplified or contrived style of performance. But there is something about the human heart that is touched by simple things. And when we do, for instance, The Journey of St. Paul, which now we do as a two-person show, I play St. Paul, my actress Maria Romine plays Bernice, the Queen of the Jews. We begin with Acts 26, where Paul is called before them and tells his story. There's nothing simpler. I'm in a toga of some sort and a beard. She's in her little, first century outfit. On this show.
The journey home.
On this show. But it touches people. It touches people in a way that it's only an hour long. It's very simple. There's no set. But there's Paul. There's Paul seemingly alive before them, speaking with passion and conviction, so that the epistles that go in one ear and out the other that we hear at every Mass suddenly come to life. And I think people are surprised that that simplicity still works.
I apologize, I got the cart a little bit before the horse on this Journey Home program because I want to remind the audience you are a convert to the church. So but you did tell your story before, but give them a little bit of a summary of why you're here on the Journey Home.
Well, I was an atheist. I became an atheist at the age of 9, and I was a strident atheist. A lot of the atheists these days, they're strident, but I think they're a little intellectually confused. But I was quite proud of the fact that I had figured the whole thing out and it was all a scam. It really was my experiences on stage that started to bring me in. And the key to that was, I learned that no matter how well I prepared for a performance, no matter how well I learned my lines, researched the character, knew my blocking, if I wasn't open to an inspiration, a literal inspiration, the performance would be lifeless and dull and uninteresting. And the same was true for my fellow actors, that all I could do was prepare and then abandon myself in the moment of a run-through or a performance. To me, I called that the life force, the creative spirit. That really is the Holy Spirit. But that was a great grace because I had a tangible experience of something beyond myself. And that was the beginning. From that point, I read a lot of Carl Jung, who was Freud's disciple. I read his entire collected works, which is like 30 volumes. He was a very spiritual writer, but he was New Age and Gnostic and had a lot of confused notions. But it was at least feeding something in me. And it wasn't until many years later when I had kids and I had some difficulties in my life and I was kind of in a foxhole that I went to the library and just picked up a book. I was interested in reading philosophy or something, and it was C.S. Lewis, God in the Dock, which is an anthology of some of his writings. He was the first Christian I had come across who could make a reasonable case for the faith. I had really only seen televangelists. That was my view of Christianity. And I think it's important to keep in mind, especially now when we're trying to reach so many atheists and agnostics out there, that the reason so many people don't like the Christian church is they see a caricature of it. They see a caricature of it in the media. They see a lot of bad Christians. There's no shortage of bad Christians in the world. And we have to keep in mind that that could be what's blocking their progress. So it was for my case. Lewis mentioned this guy, G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton was primarily responsible for Lewis's conversion. Chesterton's book, The Everlasting Man, was the capstone of what made Lewis finally convert from his own atheism into Christianity. So I started reading Chesterton. Chesterton, who is even more astonishing and even more amazing as a writer and a Christian. And then Chesterton kept mentioning this guy, Hilaire Belloc, who was Chesterton's friend. So following that thread, I finally figured out there's something here. And I had a friend, Mark Milburn, who was shepherding me into the church that I met on the internet. This was back in 2000, 1999, 2000. And I'm making the long story short. And he said, okay, if you want to come in, don't do RCIA because you might find a bad RCIA, and there's lots of bad RCIAs. And he said, knowing you, you're going to bolt. You're not going to sit there for it. He said, I'll find you a good priest for private instruction. Father John J. Hughes, a former Anglican who became a Catholic priest, and whose father told him, if you become Catholic, I will never speak to you again, which is indeed what happened. So he paid a very dear price. Father Hughes then gave personal instruction to me and my wife, Karen, and then we were received into the Catholic Church at a time when people usually aren't. Usually it's the Easter Vigil. For us, it happened to be July 30th, 2000. I later learned Chesterton was received into the church on July 30th, 1922. So we happened to have been received on the anniversary of his reception. That was 12 years ago as we speak, and since then the journey continues, but it's been a great milestone and really, really the best thing that's happened to me in my life outside of my wife and kids.
Did your conversion, which obviously partially led to the present work you're doing in Theater of the Word, did it require that you make that transition from the previous theatrical work you were doing into a more faith-centered work, or was it really just driven from your desire to serve?
I didn't think I could do faith-centered work. I thought, financially speaking, it was ridiculous. And from a worldly point of view, it is. I tell people at the end of our shows, my wife and I have two businesses. One is Upstage Productions, in which we do comedy, murder, mystery, dinner theater shows all across the country, and that's how we make our money. And then we have the Theater of the Word Incorporated, in which we travel around evangelizing through drama, and that's how we lose our money. Ignatius Press was very helpful. They lost a lot of money on us. They helped us in the early days. Father Fessio was very much interested in what we were doing. Cardinal Burke, when he was still Archbishop Burke, Archbishop of St. Louis, was very helpful in the early days. But after my conversion, we continued to do secular comedy and make a living at it. But I knew even before I was Christian that there was a fundamental religious element to all drama, both because historically drama grew out of religious festivals in Greece, and it grew out of the liturgy in England. And it was entirely, the early miracle plays and the mystery plays were entirely Christian in the Middle Ages. So drama has always grown out of religious celebration. In addition to that, there are so many things about it that fit the faith. The fact that there is plenty of self-sacrifice. Actors are very narcissistic, self-centered people, but when you're on stage, if you've got a big speech coming up and your partner skips 2 pages and you can't go back and pick it up without the whole show falling apart, you keep going. You sacrifice your own self-interest because the show must go on. All actors understand that. They understand that. All actors love what they do. They may love the fame and the money, but primarily we know we would do this if we didn't get paid. We would do this if we're like the Theater of the Word, itinerant, starving actors going around the world in a van that breaks down all the time, because there's a romance to it and because we know that we're called to do it. The sense of vocation is very strong, even in secular actors. And then there's the question of preparing for a performance and losing your life in order to gain it, or abandoning the work you've done in order to reap the rewards of a truly inspired performance that the Spirit is moving. There are so many things about drama that are religious that finally, when the opportunity presented itself and Ignatius Press said, we're going to help you with this, I said, okay, I'll do it. But up until then, I was very reluctant. I thought there's no way we can make any money at this. And that's true.
Well, last week on the journey home, we had a guest, Father Taylor, who described in his journey that it was being a part of a play that began his journey to the Catholic faith, because he was in a play where he was playing a priest, and he had no concept whatsoever of a priest. But to do the role correctly, he visits a church to know that, to know what a priest is really like, and in the context becomes a Catholic. Now I want to take this comment a little different direction, though, than where you might think I'm going. The roles that you play, in the effects that they have on you. We look at Hollywood, and it's just gone. Part of it is, the self-aggrandizement, the praise, the money, all of that. But to what extent is it also that you have people being called to play roles of characters that are less than virtuous? And they get into those roles, and you may think, no, I'm Teflon, but they ain't.
I would say it's not so much the roles as the context in which the roles serve the drama. Many people are confused about the difference between the depiction of sin in a novel or in a dramatic work and the endorsement of sin. You can play Judas, you can play Herod in a passion play, but if it's serving the overall purpose of truth, beauty, and goodness, your role functions toward a greater end. It's when you're playing a bad character in a bad play that's teaching a bad message that you're taking a risk spiritually. And you're right, that can happen, and it can really affect people negatively. On the other side, we go around, I play St. Paul, we do a show about St. Jeanne Jugan, who is the foundress of the Little Sisters of the Poor. Maria plays her. I'm sure she would say, as I would say, to play a saint, and to play a saint well, is a tremendous challenge, because you really can't indulge in sin off stage, flip a switch, and then be St. Paul on stage. That has to be the fruit of how you live. In the same way, the analogy holds that the works we do have to be the fruit of our faith and the fruit of the grace that God gives us. There can't be this separation between what we believe and how we live for an actor, between who we are and what we portray on stage, even though we're putting on a mask. It is through that mask, that persona, that we shine through. So yes, it can be a challenge, but again, I think the challenge for actors is look at the overall message of the story you're telling.
I've often wondered whether the subliminal stuff going on also depends on the formation of their conscience, to the extent that on every given moment they are able to handle, this is a persona I'm putting on, not who I am.
Yes.
And if their conscience isn't formed well, then it's hard for them to fight the battle against the influence of that character.
Yes, and actors are very volatile people. That's just our nature. We sort of live on the edge. We're always dramatic. We tend not to have a strong sense of self. So that's one of the dangers. We're kind of nuts. All creative people really, well, all people are, but creative people in particular indulge that. So I think one of the missions of Theater of the Word, although we don't really state this, is kind of a ministry to actors. One of the things we're doing, we have sort of an internet TV. If people go to our website, which is thewordinc.org, thewordinc.org, they can click and see some of the stuff we put on YouTube. One of the things we do is we have we call it a Genesian Cenacle, which is a prayer group inspired by our patron Saint Genesius, and it has to do with the relationship between acting and the faith. How can you as an actor or a performing artist keep your integrity, even your secular integrity, and be in this business? It's quite a challenge.
Back in the mid-'70s, it was about a year after my own conversion to faith as a young adult in college, I tried out for Godspell. Of course, I want the Jesus part. I didn't get the Jesus part. I got the Judas part.
Yes.
And it turned out that was one of the most powerful experiences of my life, was getting into Judas. And that was powerful for me, almost to a weeping stance, because it isn't just Judas, it's me.
Yes.
It's all of us.
Oh, yes, that's right. That's right. And that's the thing. You recognize playing a saint or a sinner, that it's you and it comes from you. And we have the capacity as men to travel that spectrum, to be, we are Judases and we are St. Paul's. And sometimes throughout the day, we'll flip-flop between the two. And part of what drama can do, both for the actor and for the audience, is it can then it can enable us to sort of play that stuff out in a safe environment so that we can then, have a catharsis or a realization emotionally and intellectually of how this all fits together.
Converts
Yes.
come into the church and are immediately saints.
Really? I didn't know that. Boy, I got a problem.
The truth is that conversion takes a long, slow process. You've been a Catholic for 12 years. Talk about the continued journey. I mean, you were an atheist, or a flaming atheist?
I would say.
You were a flaming atheist.
I would say.
And then by the grace of God, you discovered the beauty through the great witness of the faith. Was there lingering philosophical battles, other things? Talk about the continual journey into the church.
Okay, quite honestly, there are several things I can say. The first is, if you come in reading Chesterton, you're expecting an idealized church. He and Belloc loved the church so much that when they write in defense of it, you see the body of Christ, but you see the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. You don't see the church being made holy, which is what the church is right now around us. The first shock was, not only am I not a saint, where are the saints? Where's the good music? Where's the solemn liturgy? Where are the people who are taking this seriously? And it's very tempting to then start judging others all around you as not being Catholic enough. Whereas the real problem is, I'm not Catholic enough. For me, even though I really love the magisterium, the first real challenge was the teaching on birth control. And the reason it was difficult for me was I read as much as I could, and I kept reading, the church is opposed to artificial contraception. That's misleading. The church is opposed to contraception. Natural family planning isn't natural contraception. What you can do is, if you don't want to have babies, you abstain from the marital act. That's not contraception, that's self-control. The church says if you're going to engage in this with your wife, you must be open to the possibility of the transmission of life. That subtle difference changed everything for me, because then I realized that makes sense philosophically and intellectually. And then I said, okay, if we're going to do this, we need to do it right. My wife needs to get off the pill. We need to do this right. At about that same time, I picked up a flyer somewhere about Fatima and Our Lady asking us to pray the rosary every day. Well, the rosary never really meant anything to me, but I thought, okay, if this is what we're supposed to do, I'll try it. This was about 2 years after we had come into the church. But from that point of taking the church teaching on contraception seriously and praying the rosary every day, those two things for me is what really did it. That's when I really seriously started to at least try to be a good Catholic. So that from that point on, it's just been a question of how do you live it? And it's a challenge. It's especially a challenge in the creative arts. I talk a lot on my blog about what I call the Catholic ghetto mentality, which is an unfortunate thing. And maybe we see it more in the US than anywhere else. I don't know, because this is basically a Protestant country. I think what happens is we as Catholics have forgotten that the Catholic Church and art in Christendom went together. Western culture, including drama, painting, sculpture, all of that, philosophy, grew out of the Catholic Church. The matrix for it, that gave birth to it, was the body of Christ. Now, devout Catholics in particular are suspicious of anything creative, probably because creative people are weird, also because our culture is so sick, so they think, well, anything that's, drama is going to somehow be. So they start thinking like Puritans, the way the Puritans thought when they closed the theaters. The fact of the matter is Shakespeare was Catholic. Joseph Pierce and I, we have another site, which is christianshakespeare.com, in which we really make the case that Shakespeare was historically a Catholic. But whether you accept that or not historically, his plays are filled with a profoundly Christian point of view, a Christian point of view that is universal Catholic in that sense. But nowadays what we see is, we see people who are very suspicious. It's hard to sell drama at the parish level and the diocesan level. Because for one thing, there's no place for it, there's no history for it. For another thing, nobody wants to pay for it. There is a notion that devout Catholics are so desperate for any kind of sustenance, any kind of cultural sustenance, that they'll take whatever crumbs fall from the table. And so you get a vicious cycle. You get Catholics who are willing to eat the crumbs, and then the producers can't afford to produce more than crumbs. Because if you can't get paid to do good dramatic work, you can only afford to do something halfway. So it's frustrating.
I found it ironic that it is in the Catholic world that music and art, drama, and such make sense, whereas in the world of our separated brethren, it doesn't quite make sense in the theology. Yet it's often at the evangelical schools where they have big theology and music departments, but not at the Catholic schools.
Yes, and that's
what
a
is
shame.
wrong with this picture?
And one of our actors, Dave Treadway, who's a great guy and a good friend of mine, he was trained at a Protestant Bible college in Florissant, Missouri, to evangelize through drama. Now, of the dozen or so solidly Catholic colleges that the Newman Society talks about for us, none of them really focuses on drama. They may have drama departments, but none of them has really caught on to the fact that if we're going to reach people in this culture, we have to do so in a creative and imaginative way. We have to speak to the heart. We have a show called Socrates Meets Jesus, based on the book by Peter Kraft. I was able to get the rights from his publisher to adapt that for the stage. We also have the rights to film it, so incidentally, we're looking for people to help us raise money to film it. It's a tremendous way of reaching high school and college kids who are the new atheists. In that show, Socrates comes back to life, and he finds himself at a college, and of course nobody believes in Jesus, although he's taking classes on, Christology. The professors don't believe, the students don't believe, and he uses the Socratic method, as he's in his toga and they're in their modern dress, to say, well, if this is what Christ claims, why do you say this about him? If this is what the New Testament is saying, then why do you believe this? And it not only shows how a reasonable case can be made for the faith, it also shows how the characters in the drama are changed by him, including the college students who are involved in promiscuous casual sex, who aren't happy, who are, profoundly atheist, but it's not getting them anywhere. But that show captivates people in a way that nothing else does. On our YouTube page, the videos that get the #1 views, anything that deals with atheism, we get a ton of views and a ton of comments, nasty comments from atheists, but they watch it and they comment. Somehow we've got to reach these people. The sons and grandsons and daughters and granddaughters of the viewers of this wonderful network who have strayed from the faith can be reached, but they need to be reached in an imaginative way, in a way that touches their hearts.
All right, let's pause there.
Sure.
Kevin, we'll take a break. We'll come back with some more questions and some emails. Are you going to come back as Kevin, or do we know yet? We'll find out after the break. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host, and it's a great pleasure to have Kevin O'Brien joining us this evening. Boy, lots of stuff that I'd love to talk about. I did mention during the break that you mentioned Chesterton and Belloc, and there's a parallel compatriot writer that many that watch the program may have heard of, Woodhouse. P.G. Woodhouse, one of my favorite writers. You may have heard of the Bertie Wooster stories. But the reason that came to mind is that Woodhouse is sometimes criticized for this England that he creates in his beautiful stories, the comedy. Belloc thought he was the best comedic writer of the 20th century. Actually, it was Evelyn Waugh that had said that. But whether that England ever really existed is a question. But yet people love to go back to, they want that England because of the England they've got. And that seems to parallel a little bit of what you said about the church that you find in Chesterton and Belloc.
That's because, in a way, that idealized England is the soul of England, and people recognize that. In the same way, the church, the holy church, is idealized, but that really is the church. Yeah. And yet, in this fallen world, well, we never quite see that perfectly embodied. One of the reasons we're called the theater of the word incorporated is because the word incorporated literally means the word become flesh. And as actors, we flesh out the written word in dramatic performance. And as people, we have this vision of the ideal. We have this vision of the ideal church, of the saints, of how things should be. And that's the truth. You know, we did The Surprise here on EWTN, which is one of Chesterton's greatest plays. It's a brilliant play. They show it every Christmas season, so I encourage people to watch it. It's a play in which there's a puppet master, and there's a friar who's wandering, and he sits the friar down, and he says, "Let me show you my story." And his puppets play out this story of a perfect little princess, a castle, a love story. And in this little story, everyone behaves nobly. There is not only no villain in this story, there is no villainous action. There is no selfish action. Everyone behaves with integrity according to the way they should, and there's a perfect happy ending, and it's a sweet story. And he shows this to the friar, and he says, "My problem is, what would happen if these creatures came to life? As their author, I know them intimately. I love them, but they're not real." The friar prays, a miracle happens, and these puppets become real people and begin to play out the story. But there's a twist. They all have a little selfish element. The poet, who I played, drinks a little too much. He's a poet, but he's a little too self-centered. The princess is a little scheming and manipulative. But there's a moment where the poet says, you know, "I feel like I'm in heaven when I'm in your presence, princess, but I feel like I'm in heaven with a bad hangover. I have this image of this perfect, somehow we've played this out before. Somehow we've said these very words, only you were more beautiful and I was more noble." We all have that image of the truth, the idealized truth. That's what draws us toward the second coming of Christ. That's what pulls us toward trying to become sanctified and cooperating with His grace. It's painful, especially if you have a circumcised heart, as most poets and actors do. It's painful because you have to be open to the pain of sin, of not being perfect yourself, of being treated poorly by others. But through that pain comes the art that we do, and really comes the cross and the redemption of who we are. So that incarnational aspect of the Christian faith and the Catholic Church is central. The other thing I wanted to say, Marcus, while I'm thinking of it is, the one lesson I've learned above everything else since becoming Catholic is, if you want to grow closer to Christ, enter the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church provides the form, it provides the guidance, it provides the frustration, it provides the crosses, it provides everything you need to grow closer to Christ. You can grow close to Christ as a Protestant. You can grow close to Christ even as an atheist. I was close to Him in a way I didn't realize, because all goodness comes from Him. But if you really want to get closer, the way to do that is through the Catholic Church.
I was thinking that this image of what the church is and what it needs to become, and then we see the imperfections. Part of the goal of that is, when we see those imperfections, we are called at the core to recite that line from the Mass, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. In other words, we can see the problems in the church, we can point fingers all over, but in the end, it's say, wait, it's me. Renewal in the church begins here.
Yes.
And the problem of the Reformation was we saw the problems, but instead of that, it's like, I'm going to make the church what it's supposed to be.
Yes.
And the danger of that is all the different reformers created in their own image, in their own likeness,
Right.
what they wanted it to be, and it continues to this day, 500 years later, with the different splinter groups, each person seeing the imperfections in every permutation. I'm going to do it right this time. I'm going to do it right this time, as opposed to saying, mea culpa.
Yes, exactly.
Mea culpa. It's
Yes.
here. I need to grow closer to Jesus and to follow the church that he gave us.
Yes. And of course, that's what the church teaches us, that we are sinners who are in the process of being sanctified through his grace and our cooperation with it. But that's also dealing with these daily failures. Dealing with, the church is very good with helping us with that. With the Theater of the Word Incorporated, and we talked about this earlier, with any career, it's very frustrating because no matter how successful you are, there's someone more successful. There's someone with more money. If you're in show business, the real temptation is to become a star, not to focus on the quality of your work, but to do the whole Hollywood thing and think, unless I'm on a soap opera and everybody's watching me, I'm worthless. That lie that we get from the world, the flesh, and the devil, that takes us away from the recognition that worldly failure is no big deal if we're succeeding through Christ on an interior level, and then the external stuff will take care of itself. The Catholic Church is the only place where you will have the consolation of knowing, if I don't succeed in the world, I've got Christ with me. Because his disciples, when they saw him on that cross, and when they took him down and he was dead, talk about failure, that is abject failure. So there's plenty of room for failures. There's plenty of room for sinners. There's plenty of room for people who keep getting it wrong day after day. That's one of the great glories and graces of a church that understands that we're imperfect being made perfect.
Remember that old movie, Sunset Boulevard?
Yeah.
About an elderly actress
Yes.
who wants a comeback.
Right.
Cannot let
That's right. Cannot let go, right? And then Carol Burnett, the way Carol Burnett used to do that character.
Yeah. But also surrounds herself with people that don't want to let her know.
Right.
Just build constantly. I mean, really, our faith begins with us facing up to who we really are.
Well, and 20 years ago, Marcus, who was the biggest man on television? I would say Johnny Carson. Johnny Carson was the king of media. It's been 20 years since he's been on the air. He's dead now. There's a whole generation who has no idea who that man was. Yeah. He was at the pinnacle, and now he's practically unknown. And, so you have to say, the answer isn't out there. No matter what we do, we can't make ourselves successful. We have to be true to Christ and to the integrity that comes from being true to Christ. And then everything will take care of itself.
And as you mentioned a bit ago, and I want to make sure we say this to our audience, especially those that aren't Catholic that are watching, the absolute necessity of being in his church so that we know what it means to imitate Jesus correctly. Because we can define our own categories for what that means.
Right.
In fact, you can justify, as an actor,
right,
following Jesus if no one's around to give you spiritual direction, to help you see. You can hear the voices and you're gone into an image of Jesus that isn't anything close like Jesus.
And it becomes idolatry. And that's the temptation all along. But I have to mention, as far as acting goes, in this past few months, one of my greatest thrills as an actor was to do the audiobook versions of your two novels. Your audience might not know that you are a novelist. You've written two really compelling stories, How Firm a Foundation and Pillar and Bulwark. And it's a fictionalized account of a Protestant minister going through a journey of faith and how he eventually enters the church and how this affects everyone around him. I did the audiobook versions. I know you haven't heard the audiobook versions. I think they really work. We listened to them in the car.
Listen, audience, I was not comfortable with allowing the journey home to be an infomercial, but that's not the point. But the reason I haven't listened to them is because it's part of the genre. In other words, I have in my mind who these people are.
Right.
And so if in case I write another one, I want to make sure that it isn't shifted.
No, I got
you understand.
But I love doing audiobooks,
Yeah.
and we did 30 of them for Ignatius Press, and they're all available on our website. So it's not just your stuff, but fiction can really come to life with audiobooks. But the good thing about your books is you see the daily imperfections. And you told me when I interviewed you about this, that in a work of fiction, you can cover things that a guest on the journey home would never go into.
Right.
I would never talk about, I was so depressed I wanted to kill myself. I mean, it's rare for somebody to bear that. Whereas in the book, you can you can show his domestic situation, your main character, Stephen. It's so funny because he and his wife are arguing and they scream at each other. And, the fact of the matter is, even good Catholics, husbands and wives sometimes scream at each other. And to see that in the book and to see these good people, because he and his wife both very much love Jesus and want to follow Jesus, but in the midst of the pressures and the confusions and the stresses and this and the that, it's really good to kind of see in a work of fiction, oh, they're going through that too? They yell at each other. Oh, he's doubting his own vocation because things aren't going well? Wow, I'm not alone here. So I think your works of fiction, and I don't want to, we can stop talking about them, but I think they're important as completing the story of the journey home. You get a formalized presentation of people's journeys here. The fictionalized accounts can go closer to the truth.
I looked at them like another arrow in the quiver of our work. Theater's a part of that. Television's a part of that. All the different programs on Journey Home, on EWTN are part of that. Nonfiction, fiction, poetry, because different people are reached in different ways.
Yes, that's right.
And in that sense, we shouldn't be disappointed because somebody didn't like theater. Well, that's not the arrow that's going to get their heart.
Exactly.
But it might be one person. That might be the one person.
Yes.
Same thing with blogging. Not everybody's for blogging, but
Right.
you might reach that one person.
That's right. That's right. And so our job is to, as T.S. Eliot said, take no thought of harvest, but only of proper sowing. So we have to just do what we love and what we're called to do, and seek first
And
the
he
kingdom.
needed to say that because his poems were tough. We've got an email. Clint from Reno writes, I recently traveled to Europe and was awed by the beauty and art present in so many of the churches there. Unfortunately today, there seems to be a real lack of appreciation and creation for the arts. How can we bring our culture back to recognize the importance of these things?
Through truth, beauty, and goodness, through doing good art. There's so much bad art out there, even in our churches, I'm sorry to say, that it doesn't touch people. I've often wondered, why would a normal person be drawn to a typical suburban parish where, I don't want to be too critical, but sometimes the music is almost unendurable. The stained glass can be hideous. There's a church that we no longer go to where they had this abstract crucifix where it looked like Jesus was this twisted, bizarre piece of metal that does not speak to the human heart. Great cathedrals do. But even in Europe, where the cathedrals sit empty, there is a kind of a renaissance. And even here, we don't see it and we don't look at it. There is a renaissance in the arts. There have been a lot of good Christian movies made. October Baby is one of my favorites. We just saw For Greater Glory about the Cristeros. There are a lot of good, solid films being made, and even films that you wouldn't think of as Christian convey good, solid messages, even today, as far as our culture has slid. So we have to remember that the battle's never over, and that as long as we can touch on truth, beauty, and goodness, we can bring Christ to people.
When you live using the image of a soup, you're in a soup of culture that you've always been in. It's sometimes difficult to see how you've been affected by that in all of your thinking.
Right.
And some of the mottos of our culture we accept as gospel.
Yes.
For example, a motto that was created about 125 years ago. Time is money, is a lie. Time is time. But this idea of time is money is a part of the model of the industrialist, progressive, this whole soup that we're in. What about the motto of beauty is in the eye of the beholder?
Well, of course, that's subjectivism, basically. And C.S. Lewis dealt with that, where he talks about, I think this is in The Abolition of Man, he looks at textbooks, even in his day, when he wrote this in the 50s, that were saying, well, the beauty that we see is something that we bring to it. And Lewis said, well, that's not true. Our sense of the sublime, our sense of looking even at nature and being touched by a beautiful canyon or a mountain or a scene of nature, there is an objective beauty in that we are recognizing. And if that's not true, then there's no point in literary criticism. There's no point in talking about the value of any work of art if it's entirely subjective. So yes, that's a lie. It's based on a kind of half-truth, which, as we said earlier, certain people are drawn more to certain types of things. But there is an objective truth, beauty, and goodness. And it's the objective reality of these things that draw us to them.
Which is why I believe in the importance of the church and her teaching and her spirit-empowered protection of that which is good, true, and right.
Yes.
So that consciences can be formed,
yes,
out of which they can appreciate that which is truly beautiful.
Yes, and the other thing you notice after you've been a Catholic for a while is that there are certain things that just smell funny to you. They may be Catholic, but they don't seem to really be growing out of a Catholic culture. And, I wouldn't have noticed that early in my conversion. But I think the more you read Catholic authors, the more you go to Mass, the more you seek the sacraments, the more you get a sense of the mind of the Church. I think that's really a tricky thing these days, because I think Americans in particular are trained to think in an individualistic way, and they don't like the idea of, no, I want to think with the mind of the Church, because if you think with the mind of the Church, which is the mind of Christ, right, then it becomes more automatic. It's like preparing for a part. If you're an actor on stage and you meticulously block every detail from, I'll pick the coffee cup up like this, I'll bring it to my lips like so, I'll drink it in such a way, that's not living. What you want is you want to think with the mind of your character so that everything you do becomes an organic whole on stage or on film. Living as a Christian is the same thing. We want to have the mind of Christ so that the fruits we bear are His fruits and they take care of themselves.
Email Rick from Peoria. As an actor, in what ways does Kevin believe his gifts and talents can help build up the body of Christ? What encouragement would he give aspiring actors who are looking for ways to live out their faith through their work?
First of all, I think there's a danger of doing didactic Christian drama. We do comedy as well, and you can't be too didactic with comedy. But to be preachy, that's not why we do what we do. We're evangelizing, but the shows have to be good shows. They have to be engaging and entertaining. They have to stand on their own as works of dramatic literature. If you do that, then you can reach people inside and outside the body of Christ. I would encourage actors not to be discouraged, because not only is it difficult to find good work to do in the secular realm, but if they're drawn to doing anything Christian, they'll quickly see that a lot of it's just so bad. And that's part of the ghetto mentality. It's difficult to be able to afford to produce well-written, well-produced shows because nobody's going to pay you to do them. But you keep plugging away anyhow, and you say, focus on the work. I think that's key. Seek first the kingdom, and all else will follow. For actors, that means don't worry if you're famous. Yeah, you got to make enough money to support yourself. Figure out a way to do that, but focus on the work. Does the work have value? If the work has value, then you're doing what you're called to do.
I'll mention that was one of the battles I had with my own writing, was this level of didactics. Because here I am trying to use fiction to convey a conversion story. And at what point do you use the didactics like you would have here in the Journey Home program? Mm-hmm. I have Catholic writers that are saying fiction should never have any of that. Good Catholic fiction shouldn't have any of that. And then you have the other extreme where there are plenty of Christian fictions out there that all it is didactic.
Well,
trying to find the balance of telling the reality of a conversation in the midst of real life was the challenge.
And then you have authors like Chesterton, who with The Ball and the Cross, it's nothing but a debate from start to end, but it's still compelling and fascinating.
Well, Newman's Loss and Gain
Yes.
was very much that.
Yes, yes. So there is room for that. But if it's just didactic, then it won't touch people on an emotional level. So it's a little bit of both. But you know, Marcus, while we're sitting here, I have to tell one of the great behind-the-scenes stories of the journey home. And that is when I was on as St. Paul, and I scripted the whole thing because I wanted it all to come from Paul's epistles and the book of Acts. And I learned the whole thing word for word because you don't want to mess with Scripture. And then we went to tape it. And, well, you weren't too happy with some of the questions because, you as yourself as Marcus wouldn't have asked some of the questions I scripted. Yeah. And I said, well, we still have to do it. It's scripted. We got to do it the way it's scripted. And we started to. But as you talked to me as St. Paul, you got so involved in Paul that you just started asking me questions. It was like a journey home interview. And I was like, and remember, I kept trying to kind of sort of steer you back to get back on script. And then when we did Dominic Barberi, we said, well, let's not worry about a script. It's better without it.
But I remember when I did a role once in a play, I remembered one of the frustrations in local theater was it seemed like no one was learning their parts up until dress rehearsal.
Yeah, right.
And we're hoping we're getting the lines done so that when you finally do the play, you might have them right.
Know. Yeah,
but the point was you should know the part before you start rehearsal.
Exactly.
So that you can be the person.
That's exactly right.
And that's what I was thinking when we did that here. You had done all the homework.
I had, yeah.
Now you're that character. Throw out the script.
Right, no,
I'm talking to you
as
if you're that person.
And that actually, those are the most interesting parts, I think, of that segment, and that's why Dominic Barberi was better. But actors are lazy, and they don't like to learn their lines. But the way we work is my actors have to know it all, word for word, before rehearsals start. Because you have to internalize it. If you're thinking about what you're going to say, you can't just let it be natural. So yeah, you're right. That's the way to do it.
Use that as an analogy of life.
Well?
No. What is there about knowing the truth to then go out and live it?
Well, it's a part of the incarnation. If you know the truth and you avail yourself of the sacraments, it really becomes a part of you. It's like salvation. It's not just imputed. It's organic. You do start to become a better Christian. Crazy as that sounds, and as much as we may not see it, and all the starts and stops, and we make progress and we fall, acting is like life. You want to internalize it. You want to become another Christ through yourself. That's why the church is so beautiful, because the church understands that mystically, and it understands that practically and pragmatically. It understands that the mystical journey is a day in and day out bearing of the cross and a series of frustrations and a series of sufferings. But that through that, if you really know it, God will take over and you can start to live it. And you don't have to
Life
think.
isn't scripted.
Life isn't scripted. No, it's not scripted.
But we've got to know Him to whom we are to imitate.
Indeed.
And
yes.
then when we encounter everything, we know.
We can play our parts
by
the way
grace,
we should. Yes.
We can seek to imitate our Lord.
If our role is to be a Christian, then we have to prepare for that role as an actor would prepare for playing his own part.
All right. Email Alan from Delaware quickly. Will you explain the logic of Christianity to someone who doesn't accept that there is anything more to life than the here and now? What we can see and experience? My friend doesn't think there are any convincing reasons to believe in God or Christianity in one day.
Well, you probably logically can't do it. You have to do it through truth, beauty, and goodness. And, I have a young atheist friend who believes that our sense of beauty is merely Darwinian and biological and only serves to propagate the species. He doesn't think there's any lasting value to beauty or to any human work of art. But his heart doesn't believe that. His head does, but his heart doesn't. We know that the things we do, great works of art, have an eternal significance, as does every action that we act every day.
Yeah, maybe the most important way to convince a total unbeliever who believes only in the senses is to get them experience something which they cannot prove by the senses, which is friendship.
Yes, or holiness, because
yes.
Newman, it was Blessed Dominic Barberi. It was the witness of holiness. Newman was intellectually converted, but until he met someone holy, a holy Catholic, he didn't make the jump. When he met Blessed Dominic Barberi, that was the final piece of the puzzle.
If they want to contact you, how do they do it?
Our phone number is toll-free 888-840-WORD, W-O-R-D, and then our website is really the best, which is thewordinc, THEWORDINC.org.
Always a pleasure, Kevin.
Yes, it is, Marcus. Thank you. God bless.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you for joining us on this special episode of The Journey Home. God bless. See you again next week.